Here's a bold prediction for you, America. Earl Little is about to be your new favorite Ohio State safety. Welcome to Snap Judgments. It is spring practice number 10 in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. Snappy Jays with Jeremy Birmingham. I am Austin Ward on 97.1 The Fan and 10 TV. Talk to the defensive backs. Matt Guerrieri, Tim Walton, Jalen McClain, Earl Little, Leroy Roker, and Devin Sanchez. A very confident group, a very outspoken, dynamic personality group. And somehow, Birm, it just feels like Earl Little is actually the one that's pushing it forward right now, even though he's only been here for 3 months.
You say confident, but it's also comfortable. Like, this was a group of guys that were really seemed at ease with the day's conversation, very sure of where they're going in this defense. And it's interesting because I don't think neither Matt Guerrieri nor Tim Walton gave away any secrets about like where they're going with this defense and what they're doing. Talked a lot about the disguise elements in Ohio State, how they want to use multiple players in multiple spots, and that's something Earl Little talked about. Devin Sanchez talked about how, you know, he really feels like he belongs now, which is something he said he struggled with a year ago. So it's comfortable, it's confident, and it's going to be a collection of guys that I think people are going to be surprised at how good this secondary ends up being, because you lost Caleb Downs and you lost Davis Igbenos and then you lost Lorenzo Styles, and then they're deeper and they're probably more versatile, which is, again, I asked Matt Guerrieri, like, is this a crazy notion? And he said, kinda, but it's probably true.
Yeah, and there's a pretty big caveat on that, because he sat down and James Laurinaitis walked by and he goes, "Hey, how do you replace Caleb Downs?" Like, that's been the question that's going over and over and over. Yeah. And of course, it came up in the flow of conversation. How could it not? But I think the point is, one player is not going to be able to do it. Collectively, which is your point,
yeah,
Ohio State has that. And they have, that's the part that's interesting to watch, is that Lorenzo Styles was going to play nickel. And there were more clearly defined roles in that secondary. Now, Caleb can go do anything he wanted to. He's in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center today getting some work in. But when you look at Roker, when you look, even, you know, Terry Moore's been on the outside of that conversation and he didn't talk after practice on Wednesday in here. But when you have Earl Little, who can play all three spots, and Jalen McClain can play all three spots, and Leroy Roker can seemingly play all three spots, that opens up a lot more options for you in the playbook for Matt Patricia and for that group that's working with the secondary. You know, and that's not to say that the overall talent level is going to be higher, because that's a difficult thing to wrap your brain around when you are taking out a top 10 draft pick, a top 5 draft pick. But, you know, we've said going into spring, that's going to be the most fascinating dynamic, is who lines up where, how much flexibility is there to move around from those spots, and then how close to that level of production can you get. And the way that people are talking about Earl Little specifically is like, you know, not Downs, but maybe that next notch below.
Yeah, I mean, it's all up. It's not Downs, but it's definitely up for Earl Little.
Oh.
And it's up for Leroy Roker. It's up for Jalen McClain. I mean, all these guys are being put into a position now at Ohio State where, you know, Jalen started a year ago, so he's comfortable, but he's going to be asked to do new things. He's going to be asked to take on new roles as a leader. And none of them seem worried about how they replace anybody. It's like, we're going to do our thing. We're all going to play different spots, and that's what Earl Little was asked. Are you at the nickel? Are you doing this? And he said, I'm doing everything.
Yeah.
So that is the expectation.
Which is the same thing that Leroy Roker said, which is the same thing that Jalen McClain said.
Exactly. So all of these guys are in a position right now where the flexibility of this group is different than it was a year ago. And it's not even to mention a guy like Terry Moore, or even the younger guys like Blaine Bradford, et cetera, who are in a position as well to make some noise. So it's a group that I think people will be really interested to get to know more about. I wish we could have had a chance to talk to Cam Calhoun, someone like that today, just because of personality.
He was around.
Personality-wise, Cam Calhoun, man, is a guy that you can understand why four teams in 4 years. But people like him,
yeah,
because he is just so personable. It's not a guy who's just like a malcontent. He just likes to bounce around. He has a good time. Obviously, he's a former teammate of Jermaine Matthews at Winton Woods, so you've got a little bit of a similar personality there.
Well, tell them why. He likes to talk trash.
They like to talk. They like to talk. You know, this defense, I think that's the interesting thing. In a defense where you're replacing 8 starters, and there's nobody who seems out of place at this juncture. And today just happened to be the defensive backs on display.
Yeah, because I asked, you know, Devin Sanchez has been talking about finding his voice and his comfort, and he's never going to be the one who wants to initiate the trash talk. And I don't know if he wants to even be the one to necessarily initiate the leadership component. And he said, I got other guys that can do that.
Yeah.
And he is willing to talk about being a Thorpe finalist, winning the Thorpe Award, being an All-American, and like having those immediate goals for this year. That's all encouraging. But I was like, all right, well, if you're not going to talk trash, who is? And then he pointed to Cam Calhoun, who came over and was like, I got that covered for the group. Don't worry. Yeah. So he's going to be the hype man. I think he's got a chance to be more than that. I remember coming out of week 2 of spring camp, there were some people in the Woody like, we really like what you see from here with the veteran know-how, the confidence that he plays with, the physicality. He's not going to supplant any of those guys in the starting lineup. But if that is your third or maybe more likely fourth corner, that's a pretty good spot to be in, because even as he's bounced around and some of the production has varied depending on where he is, I think if you look at what he did 2 years ago at Utah, I think it was 8 passes broken up in that year. He's performed at a high level for good defenses, and that's like your safety net.
Yeah, and I thought, Devin Sanchez is a guy who's always been extremely serious about his craft. He said that a year ago he was probably a little too timid when he got to campus, and said a little bit of the expectations that were on him by people like myself, for example, probably got in his head a little bit. But he said it was at the end of the season, and specifically the Miami game, where he realized, hey, I can do this. And that moment, he said, was when he really started to feel confident in what he can do. He doesn't need to be the trash talker. He is going to be confident. He is going to be a leader. He said, with all these new players, like, someone has to step up and be that guy. And he seems to be comfortably accepting that role. We didn't talk to Jermaine Matthews today. We didn't talk to Dominic Kelly. We didn't. So
Devin, Jermaine a couple weeks ago.
Devin was the only corner that we got a chance to speak with. So he was kind of speaking for the group, talking about the confidence of that group, but most of it's about him. And what are your expectations? What do you want for yourself this season? And he's not shying away from the expectations that were a little too heavy a year ago. He's now taking and putting back on himself, saying he wants to be an All-American. He wants to win the Thorpe. So I guess it's a different world when you're putting those expectations on yourself, which is a plus for a guy like him.
Yeah, when Matt Patricia is still out here after practice. That is his voice. If that picked up, he is barking defensive signals, still talking to Jalen McClain and James Smith hanging around. He's been doing Matt Patricia, by the way, a lot of coaching. So when we're talking about a snappy J, last players off the field, today it's the last coach, Matt Patricia, hanging around. James Smith has been throughout camp refusing to leave, but also Jalen McClain, who had one of his longest press conferences at Ohio State. It's another part of this leadership component that we talked about. When you have so few starters coming back, all of that was going to be thrust on Jalen McClain to carry over the culture and carry over the on-field production, but also to go be, the spokesman for this team, that the way that, Caleb Downs was a year ago, or, thinking about Denzel Burke the year before that, Lathan Ransom before that. Like, someone has to do that, and that was never a spot that I think, if you're talking about both those guys similarly, Devin Sanchez and Jalen McClain, that's not something that they are volunteering. They really want to do. That's important to them. Now, conversely, you can tell Earl Little is incredibly good at it. Yeah. That was one of the more engaging introductory press conferences you'll ever see from a player. He's talking about being ready to go to war right now and wanting to be in the horseshoe next week so he could experience that for himself, and that he would fight and die for his brothers. Like, he is acclimated to this group in a hurry, which I think is probably a little bit of a load off for Jalen McClain, that he doesn't have to do all of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that Earl Little brought up was that it's just the competitive nature of Ohio State. Ryan Day has been imploring the media in the last couple of weeks to go ahead and ask these transfers, why is it different at Ohio State? And so he was asked what was different about Ohio State versus Alabama or Florida State. And he said the one area is that they're competing in everything. When you're in the weight room, it's a competition every single day. He said, so you can't have a bad day here, which is a direct Ryan Day-ism. So you do start to see that these guys are absorbing the culture and then immediately reflecting it, which is actually the value of bringing in veteran players like Earl Little. You're getting a guy who understands when he walks into the weight room, the hardest worker on the Ohio State football team is the best player in the country, in Jeremiah Smith. And so when you see that, it is impossible for a guy who comes from a program like Alabama and like Florida State. He said he knows what it takes to win in this sort of environment, but it still has to be incredibly refreshing to see when you walk in that Jeremiah Smith isn't a diva, that he's not here being treated any differently than anyone else. He's still being the leader of the pack. Brandon Innes, who he was extremely close with growing up, like, he's watched Brandon and what this program has done for him. And, Ryan talked about the way that the previous players have impacted the current transfers and given them insight into what Ohio State's about. And Earl Little is a great example of that coming to fruition.
Yeah, and he also that's the Caleb Downs effect as well, and not just theory versus testimony, but also his relationship with Earl Little Jr. and James Smith and Quay Rousseau. Like, these guys, listen to him.
Yeah.
They're listening to him right now as we're talking during Snappy J's. Like, that voice carries a lot of weight. I think that's also why, when you combine that with the Matt Patricia effect, the way that Matt Guerrieri has connected, Tim Walton's reputation that is continuing to grow, not just as a recruiter, but developer of cornerback talent. There are a lot of things that, even when you have this level of turnover and attrition for BIA in that secondary, it's like, it's not slowing down. And I think it's crazy that it's a legitimate conversation that it could potentially be even better. Are we way ahead of things? Is it premature to say that in April? Of course it is. But you can tell, get a pretty good idea of what the potential is for a group in these practices. I was told they didn't have any live periods in scrimmaging today, but which makes it hard to evaluate. But the 7-on-7 stuff, the competitive work, the weight room stuff that's carrying over from spring has all really resonated with the staff. You can tell. And
it's going to be hard to really glean much from this in the spring game, because I don't expect Earl Little will play a whole bunch in the spring game.
I don't know I would.
We're not going to see a lot of these guys who are going to be counted on. And so the fan base may not get to see what that's going to look like until August probably. But, they're going to do some, I was told they're going to tackle for most of the spring game, except for the very beginning when Jeremiah Smith's out there. They want to go thud in those moments, but they're going to be competitive. So it'll be interesting to see, because Earl Little talking about how he wants to be out there for the spring game. We'll see how much of that he's allowed to do, because it seems like he is becoming a pretty integral part of what Ohio State wants to do with their defense.
Yeah, it's a week and a half away now. Where's it, Birm? Is it? Oh,
that way.
It's over there. Okay. That's where the horseshoe is.
I'm getting better directionally.
I know. David, 1% better
over there
every day, which is what the Buckeyes are trying to do. They're now 10 practices in, and they're nearing this final home stretch here of spring camp. It's been a blast so far, but there's a lot more to come on the Austin and Birm Show on 97.1 The Fan and 10 TV. Tomorrow, we'll have 3 Thoughts Thursday on the beat. We will have a mailbag on Friday. You want to get those questions into the Austin and Birm Show at gmail.com. We would love to read them and perhaps answer them on that show, and we'll be back in this building on Friday for practice number 11. And some more Snappy J's will be coming your way then. That's a wrap on this Wednesday version, though. He's Birm. I'm Austin. We'll talk to you tomorrow.